this episode, we're excited to welcome Greg Epstein to the pod. You want to talk a little bit about Greg and his book and why you wanted to have him on?
Oh, his book's fantastic. It made our top 10 list for 2024. There's sort of a natural metaphor about tech and religion and cults and what have you. But his book is different than just extending the metaphor. His book goes into the scholarship, does the true contrast, and then most importantly talks about the need for reformation. And delightfully written. He's a wonderful guy to interview. So
I'm very excited about this one. I agree with you. I think the thing that stands out is there's a lot of things where people just sort of throw around the idea, about tech being a cult, etc. Extending to calling it a religion is a little bit less common, but also getting to the depth of scholarship that Greg gets to in his book. But I think that the book is an important read because it really makes the whole understanding of this comparison so much more important. You get a sense of the gravity of this and this metaphor, if you will, right, of thinking about it in that way. But it is such an important lens to see how tech has gotten to where it is, and also to be able to imagine where it might go in the future. And that is mostly a scary topic. But with that intro, I guess I'll hand it off, and I hope you enjoy our conversation with Greg Epstein. Greg, thanks so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you today.
Thanks, Helen and Dave. It's great to be with you.
Let's start. We'd like to hear the story of what inspired you to write this book.
Sure. So it goes back fairly early in my career. The sort of origin story of this is, first of all, I am a humanist chaplain. I serve the non-religious as a religious advisor. I mean, it's sort of an oxymoronic role that I've really loved, and I've been in that role at Harvard University for a little over 20 years. And what attracted me to that role was the idea that I saw religion as a non-religious person as maybe the most powerful social technology ever created. And I wanted to be involved in helping people to create better social community, better even congregations, because I saw a new generation rising that was and still is the most secular, the most non-religious generation, certainly in the United States' history. And I felt that generation needed to be more connected with one another, and brought closer together. But the problem with that is that I wasn't just referencing my own language or the language of the humanist movement, which we can talk about what that is if people are interested, but I was sort of referencing there Mark Zuckerberg's language in recreating the Facebook, now Meta, mission statement in 2017, where he talked about bringing the world closer together. And at that point, I had been working for about a decade on building a kind of formal humanist congregation. And I heard Zuckerberg's language in talking about the aims of his company, which had by that point sort of taken over my life and taken over the lives of a lot of the people that I was serving. And it really struck me that Facebook and other apps and technologies like it were a kind of new form of congregation for the 21st century, and that they were collectively not only replacing, even superseding religious ways of gathering, religious ways of connecting, religious ways of being in community with one another. And I don't mean that in the sense of that they were somehow morally superseding these previous generations of innovation. I don't think that they were doing so in a way that was healthy for society in many cases, but just on a pragmatic level, they had taken over, they had kind of conquered or colonized the ground on which many of those previous forms of social organizing had stood. And it struck me then that there was that real parallel between technology and religion. And then I started to think, wait, are there other parallels between modern tech, Silicon Valley tech, and religion? And I started scribbling a list of ways in which they were parallel. The first list that I ever scribbled to that was in the back of a book called Winners Take All by a writer named Anand Giridharadas, who then ends up becoming a sort of featured character in the beginning of my book. And I realized I was making a list of parallels between tech and religion that has never to this day stopped. And this has now been 6 years that I've been working on this. And what I've found is that as somebody who has studied religion and its structures and its communities and its beliefs and history from a non-religious perspective for 20, 25 years, my entire adult life, and then some, because my fascination with religion goes back into my childhood. I have truly come to believe that this new phenomenon we call Silicon Valley or big tech or any number of other sort of mythological names is a kind of religion for the 21st century, and that if you do want to characterize it that way, if you do want to sort of follow me down that rabbit hole of making that comparison, then it's actually not just a religion anymore. It's actually the religion of the world today, in the sense that what's more powerful, what's more influential on more people's lives in the world today? Is it Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, etc.? Or is it this thing that we call Silicon Valley big tech? And as I've said to many of my chaplain colleagues, 40, 50 of us at Harvard, 30 or so of us at MIT in the past few years, I don't think it's particularly close. I think that the tech is far more influential on our way of thinking about ourselves and our lives and our future today than are any of those religious traditions. And I think that, there are certain strengths to that, but ultimately I find it to be a pretty scary phenomenon. And so what inspired me to write this book is the deep desire to convene some kind of conversation about that, between myself and tech people, between myself and religious people, and communities, and just sort of everyday citizens who are the kind of often unwitting worshipers at these altars, right? That this is sort of the kind of religion that you had in the ancient world, where you were born under the realm of a given god, and you didn't really get a lot of choice about that. It wasn't like an option whether to worship or not, whether to go to the temple or not, whether to make sacrifices to the gods or not. It was what you were going to do, or you were going to suffer painful consequences. And that's the kind of religion that I think all of us are being born or born again into these days. And that's really what inspired me to write this book.
The word unwitting is powerful, I think, in this context. So let's start with, just for listeners who haven't read your book yet, some of the key principles that you find that you find align or compare tech with historical previous religions. I'm not sure what the right sort of comparison word there is, but with other religions. Like how do you help just sort of give us that cheat sheet of the definition of why you see tech as a religion?
Yeah, so there's no one definition of religion that works in every case. And I spoke to, in addition to 7, 8, 9, 10 years of formal study of religion academically in my background, and all the years of practice, as I was writing this book, I spoke to a lot of leading scholars of religion and asked them, how do you define religion? How do you define theology? How should I help readers make sense of this? And, the key, or the sort of, the beginning of the story is that there's no one way to understand exactly what religion is, but religion has structures. It has sacred texts. It has sacred spaces. It has prophets and priests and beliefs about what came before this life and what comes after this life. It has a longing for the transcendent and a fear of doom. And tech really does have all of those things. From the desire to end death as we know it, as the famous AI pioneer Ray Kurzweil talks about when he talks about the singularity, the idea that there is a day about to dawn when all will be transformed, when all those who understand fully will be sort of taken up to a higher plane, and perhaps others that do not fully comprehend how to take advantage of that situation will suffer. That's a typical or classic eschatology. A view of reality and where it's headed. That you find sort of almost equally in the Christian and other religious worlds and in the tech world. There's this concept called long-termism in big tech in Silicon Valley, where many different communities, often led by or participated in by multi-billionaire venture capitalists, founders, etc., investors, will talk about a world millions of years from now, perhaps, where there are trillions of digital beings, digital souls that have been uploaded into some sort of space cloud powered by the power of distant stars. And things will be dramatically better in that realm. But if you don't do what it's necessary to go to that realm, then you'll suffer, and it's very important to follow the right path. For example, there is the concept in AI research of existential risk, or X risk, which means thousands of AI researchers, practitioners, etc., were interviewed over a period of years, and the finding that they came to, that you can read on a site like 80,000 Hours, the career advising, life advising website of the effective altruist movement, I should say the many times over billionaire backed effective altruism movement, shows that the most serious problem that you can work on, and I cover this in chapter 2 of Tech Agnostic, the most serious problem that you can work on in the world today, if you're a young person trying to find purpose in life, and that you should work on, is the problem of the existential risk posed to humanity of runaway or unaligned or evil artificial intelligence, because that is said to have a 10% risk of destroying all of humanity in the coming century. And that 10% risk is assessed as the single greatest, by far, risk that humanity faces today, bigger than climate change, bigger than racial injustice, bigger than economic problems, bigger than nuclear weapons, anything. and young people are directed into this. And so these are some of the what I call the theological or doctrinal ways in which, you know, you have a kind of heaven in the case of the long-termism fantasy. You have a kind of hell in the case of an X-risk fantasy. And, you know, we're sort of motivated, like, do what the God says. And in this case, there really is a huge discourse on AI or artificial general intelligence as God itself. So do what God says and get rewarded with heaven, or don't do what God says and go to hell. That's a trope that runs through Christianity and other religions, and in this sort of AI-centric tech religion that I'm describing. And then in latter chapters, I talk about the hierarchies in the different religions and in tech, and the rituals that, you know, a good sticky religion, meaning a religion that draws you in and keeps you in, will have lots and lots of rituals. And certainly, as I hold before you my stained glass Black Mirror altar, to which I personally genuflect, you know, over 100 times a day, you know, this religion is absolutely filled up with rituals as well. And then finally, you know, unlike other religions I could name, this one has a real non-zero chance of actually causing an apocalypse. What could go wrong, right?
Well, they tell you what can go wrong in their books and their manifestos and such.
Yeah, I mean, you know, religions don't only, if they want to be effective, they don't only promise you a better future. You know, because if all religions had to offer, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, if all they had to offer was follow us and you'll find a better future, I don't think it would be all that motivating for a large portion of their potential audience. Yes, a carrot can be motivating to a rabbit or whatever. But, you know, if you give a rabbit a carrot, but the rabbit is triggered to think that there's danger that lies ahead, then the rabbit's not going to want your carrot. You know, a rabbit has certain ways to avoid a poisoned carrot. So, you know, the best way to motivate a rabbit to do anything is to, you know, to chase it, right? I mean, to motivate it with fear. And sometimes we act like rabbits, you know, what can I tell you? And so religions dangle fear as well. They motivate you with the fear of punishment, eternal and otherwise. And so does tech. Again, you know, that's why if you have people who are called AI doomers, warning you about the dangers of AI, some people would assume that those doomers, you know, among them being somebody like a Geoffrey Hinton, who now has won the Nobel Prize in physics, even though it's not clear that he's actually a physicist because of his AI leadership. He received the prize. You know, people would say, well, if they're a doomer and they're worried about the doom of AI, then they're really not a tech proponent, are they? But I fit that sort of doomerism into the category of religious messages about hell. You know, if you have a religious preacher preaching about hell, it's not that they're not religious. To the contrary, you know, they're actually very zealously religious, and I think the doomerism is very much part of that religion, because of the tech religion, because the whole idea is do it our way and only our way, or you'll be doomed. And there's very little space for just sort of like, can I just opt out? Can I get off this roller coaster? Can we focus on human problems, human connections, human love, human vulnerability? That's really not one of the options on the menu, even for the doomers, I don't think.
What religion is this most like?
You know, it sort of reminds me of Julia Angwin, the New York Times tech policy columnist, at one of my book launch events in New York City with All Tech is Human, asked me, she said, you know, she seemed quite willing to buy into the idea of tech as a religion, and said, all right, but who's Jesus? And, it's a fun question, but the point, of course, is that it depends on which Jesus you're talking about, right? Because if you've got a couple billion Christians in the world, you might have a billion or two different visions or versions of what Jesus is supposed to be. So, if I said to you, well, it's most like Christianity, I mean, which Christianity? There are Christianities that are incredibly fundamentalist, reactionary, obsessive about regulating and controlling people's bodies and their minds and their reproductive capacities and all sorts of things. But there are also Christianities that are much more about love and justice and embracing and helping the stranger and the orphan and the meek, the least of these. And it's not, so therefore it's not like the tech religion that I'm talking about is one or the other. And in fact, it's, if anything, it's like all religions in the sense that it has its good side and its bad side, right? My book, Tech Agnostic, is not an anti-religious book. And it's not an anti-tech book either. It's from the perspective of a non-religious person, and it's from the perspective certainly of a critic of modern day tech. But I mean, how could you not recognize that technology today is doing all sorts of positive things for people, including myself? I mean, of course it is. It would be absurd to try to write a completely anti-technology book. I don't know that I've ever even read one that's worth reading. But what it is to say, we need to limit the worst impulses of any religion, including this tech religion, and try to emphasize the best instincts of any religion, including this tech religion. I prefer religions that are reformed. I prefer Christians who know how to criticize Christianity, Jews who know how to criticize Jewish theology, history, Israel, etc., Muslims who know how to criticize Islam. Yeah, I even prefer, if you can imagine, Buddhists that know how to criticize Buddhism, because I did Buddhist studies and Eastern religious studies in college, and they get marketed very well, but they're not perfect either. And my favorite Buddhists are the Buddhists that recognize that even Buddhism has plenty of flaws, and if you want to practice Buddhism, you're going to want to be aware of those and try to mitigate against them, try to bring out the best possibilities for Buddhism, not the sort of strangest, most manipulative, most judgmental kinds.
When it feels like it's changed, there isn't obviously a monolithic place here to sort of do this comparison, but right now it feels like it's a little bit Greek godish. It's more than there's multiple deities that stand for different things. There's a lot more sort of hero overcoming. It almost feels quite, in some ways, it's sophisticated, but quite immature as a religion.
I mean, I love that idea. I would say, of course, far be it from us to call Hinduism an immature religion, in the sense that although the word Hinduism was not even chosen by the people who call themselves Hindus themselves, it was sort of foisted upon them by Westerners, by Christians who wanted to impose the category of religion that they understood from the top down onto the South Asian subcontinent. But nonetheless, Hinduism has all of these different gods, and there you have it. It's that's part of the religion that I'm describing as well.
Yeah, there's no singular figure in this religion. You talk in the book about digital Puritanism. Can you describe that and also describe why you think it's important?
So, Puritanism generally is this tradition that that is the founding tradition of Harvard University, mind you. The group of Puritan Christians who were essentially so religious that they were too religious for England in the 17th century, and they get kicked out because they're so overzealous. They come across the Atlantic and they settle in the Massachusetts Bay, and they try to impose their like really top-down, very extreme vision of Christianity on their young, who after a little while start to rebel against that. And so the Puritans decide, well, we need a college, a university, in order to train these people about how to think, and that becomes Harvard. So the Puritan idea is essentially, obviously I'm oversimplifying, sure, but it really is essentially that that there is an elect group who worship the Christian God and gods, the triune God in the proper way, or at least let me not misstate it. That there is an elect that is properly beloved by the Christian God. That is the right kind of Christian, and that elite will ascend to heaven eventually, and be rewarded ultimately. Everybody else goes down to the bad place, and it's really the dark, deep fire and brimstone kind of bad place. It's not like a warm and fuzzy hell in the original Puritan vision, and that there's nothing you can do to change your fate. You can do the Protestant work ethic. You can show how great you are, but all that does is, in the theology, is serve to demonstrate to others that, of course, you're obviously one of the elect. It doesn't actually change your fate one way or the other. Well, I see, and I talk about this, tell the story of this in chapter 1 of the book for those who are going to want to read it in more detail that I'll describe here, because I'll only give a hint at it here. I see a dramatic parallel between that Puritanism, Puritan theology, and even some of the history of Puritanism, and what the reality of Silicon Valley is today. And, by the way, the Puritans, they talked about a sort of mythological shining city on a hill that wasn't a real place, but it was a sort of construct in their minds that they wanted to return to. It was sort of inspired by the city of Jerusalem, which is in fact a city on a hill, but it was more of a mythological place than anything else, and that's Silicon Valley, right? Which is not an actual real place with borders and a mayor or a governor. It's a mythological shining city on a hill to which we can point and project anything we want. And in that place, you have a kind of elect who, maybe not all of them envision themselves as actually literally touched by the spiritual hand of God in some, completely literalistic way. Although, I don't know, increasingly, Peter Thiel is talking about, he's giving talks for the Hoover Institution about the apocalypse and apocalyptic spirituality. Elon Musk is now flirting with Christianity in a way that he hadn't in the past. Mark Zuckerberg is flirting with religion in these last several years in a way that he hadn't as a young person. Bill Gates is talking on Reid Hoffman's podcast about how we're going to all need a new religion or spirituality in the age of AI. And so, there may even be a kind of literalistic vision of these elite, elect founders as transcending the rest of us. And then there is the rest of us. And, it's true that in Puritanism, there's nothing you can do to go from one rung of the ladder to the other. And that in any charitable or reasonable interpretation of Silicon Valley dogma or doctrine, there might be some things that you could do to go from being just a regular person to being a founder or a VC or whatever. But when you look at the fact that that AI in so many ways and the surrounding technologies are exacerbating inequality, exacerbating racial divides, gender divides, I'm not so sure that the difference between the traditional Puritanism and its hierarchies and the one of today is very great. So there you have it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, I think that there's definitely a Puritanism aspect to it, and a reverence for purity, right? In terms of a pure adoption of tech, a pure understanding of tech.
Pure technology, pure facts, pure science.
And there's sort of this elusive, this has to be you learn the way, in order to truly be part of the inner circle. But I find your book and your propositions to be really quite perfect. As someone who grew up in a religious family, who is now quite considered atheist, as is Helen. So I mean, but I come from I look at the valley, and I can see the hierarchy of priests. I can see the acolytes who are the founders who worship at the feet of, the Zuckerbergs and the Elons. I can see the vestry as, the venture capitalists who are funding all of this and making it all work in the background. I mean, you can play around with the analogies and metaphors really quite helpful in quite a lot of interesting ways.
Yeah.
Beyond that, though, I find it to be really quite just helpful and powerful to sort of recognize what is happened with this industry, and the fact that it stands alone in terms of other industries with this worship aspect to it, and the rituals
thank you. I really appreciate that, especially because I wrote the book, not just to sort of poke fun at Silicon Valley and its leaders, and in fact, I really do want to emphasize that whether or not we discuss it, that's either way is fine. But I take at least the last third, if not more like the last half of the book, to discuss sort of the positive alternative to this, the Reformation, if you will.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I wanted to be helpful to people who, maybe sort of so immersed in this Silicon Valley water that we're like the fish now that doesn't necessarily realize that it's wet, and so, if there were such strange ideas that I just described, about, and you just described as well, about how tech functions in our society, if there was the equivalent religion that had risen up in the past generation or so, and was a new religion, and it was gaining billions of followers who were worshiping daily, in a very devout way, and that the religion was asking people to tithe enormous amounts of money, and it was building enormous temples, and it was influencing governments and policies and sort of shaking to the core some of our most well-established social institutions. I mean, people would panic. They would say, what is this cult that we've been taken over by? But because this is seen as a secular institution, a business primarily, an industry, and we're sort of predisposed in American society, at least, to treat industry as this sort of neutral, objective institution that should be protected at all costs and not criticized, because of course it's just sort of it's how we best function is through industries. we don't necessarily see what we've gotten ourselves into. And so the tech industry is a thing that people still say all the time, but it's absurd. There's no one industry in the world that you can point to at any real scale that isn't the tech industry. Said this to one interviewer, well, maybe basket weaving isn't a tech industry, and she happened to know about basket weaving. She said, no, even basket weaving, very much a tech industry now.
Yes.
It's been techified. And so, that's the way we're living now. Everything, everywhere, everyone is under the thrall or under the thumb, under the influence of this tech phenomenon, that it's more than just an industry. It's better understood as a religion, because if we had a religion influencing us that much, we'd have to criticize it, we'd have to rein it in, we'd have to demand reform. And we're not doing anywhere near enough of those things with tech.
Yeah, and what I like about your book is that, to continue the fish metaphor, it's like the stick of dynamite that gets thrown in, and all the fish die and float to the surface, and we have to sort of question our assumptions about this. So what is the Reformation? What is the Enlightenment?
First of all, I spoke to a couple hundred people for this book over the course of 6 years, and many of them are what I would call heretics, apostates, Cassandras, to use a mythological character of the woman shrieking about injustice and being ignored. And the first thing I found is that we've got to do a lot better of a job of paying attention to our Cassandras and our heretics and our apostates who have something very valuable to tell us about the harms that everyday tech is causing. And I'm not talking about the doom harms, everything's going to hell in the distant future, or 20 years from now. I'm talking about the environmental harms, the social and racial injustice harms, all those sorts of things. So that's sort of a first issue. But there's more. There is the idea of people who are creating the positive alternative, right? The idea of the humanist or the mystic or the spiritual practitioner who is not about making maximum profit or converting maximum numbers of worshipers, but is about healing and making human life better. And there are a lot of equivalents to that in the tech world, including my friend Kate O'Neill, who is billed as the tech humanist in the tech world. I'm the tech humanist, I guess, now in the humanist world, but she's such in the tech world. The data feminists that are behind me, Ruha Benjamin and others who are working on Afrofuturism and imaginative futures in technology. Benjamin is a professor in both computer science and African American studies at Princeton. All sorts of reformers. And what I've tried to do here in my book, Tech Agnostic, is to sort of weave together their stories to show that there is really potentially an equally influential new movement arising where people do understand what it looks like to live a better life alongside tech, but not dominated by it. Now, whether that group of people will sort of win out or not, that remains to be seen. I'm agnostic about that.
That does. How different do you think it is that there is a real grounding here in in scientific development, in things that can be built and tested in the real world, in things that are genuinely sort of scientific in that frame of, and it's a little bit of a frame from sort of the early 2000s, but science versus religion. Do you think that there's a difference there?
Yeah, that framing was influential on me. A little backstory that I don't often get to talk about is that I decided in the year 2000, late in the year 2000, that I was going to spend my life as humanist clergy. And back then, that was a really weird choice to make. There were so few people who were doing anything along those lines, and I knew of a handful of them, and that was it. But I actually got the sense in late 2000, as a 23 or so year old, that this was my calling, like a secular calling, right? And I mean, it's played out that way, right? I'm still here doing this stuff nearly a quarter century later. But one of the things that bugged me at that time that I wanted to work on was the fact that the humanism as a tradition philosophically, in my first book, Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe, I tell the story of how it has this thousands of years of history that go back to both the East and the West, that people all over the world have pioneered ways of thinking humanistically, as opposed to traditionally religiously about the world and about human life. But that it's very, very few people know anything about that. And you'd never see it, say, on a magazine cover. And back then, magazines actually mattered, of course, and they've been completely, supplanted by all sorts of other things. But back then, they mattered a lot. And in 2006, Wired magazine, of all magazines, ran a cover story written by a guy named Gary Wolfe, who was an editor there, who did things like Profile, Ray Kurzweil. But this cover story was The New Atheism. No heaven, no hell, just science. And it absolutely fascinated me that, finally we had arrived. We had our own cover story of Wired magazine. That was the big deal back then. But I was also disappointed about what kind of cover story it was, the framing of it. No heaven, no hell, just science, The New Atheism. It featured people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens with books like The God Delusion and God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, and The End of Faith. And that wasn't my perspective on religion or on atheism. I take more of a live and let live approach. I take more of we're all neighbors, and we may have different beliefs about certain things, but we can learn very much from one another, and we can care about one another, and we can work together. We're all tied in a single garment of destiny, in an inescapable mutuality, to echo Martin Luther King Jr. And so I wanted to fight for a different kind of humanism, which I take as a positive word for what other people might refer to as atheism or agnosticism. Focuses on what I am and what I stand for and what I do believe in, rather than what I disbelieve. And there's been this clash, I think, ever since then. It's at times it's more of an aggressive clash. At times it's more of a friendly argument, or even sort of a continuum between two worlds. Between the sort of aggressive, rationalistic science as all things kind of new atheist, and the more humanistically oriented, non-religious humanist like myself. Well, it turns out that the tech world, the Silicon Valley world, is quite secular. There's this phrase, "Come get your people," And when I see Silicon Valley types misbehaving, I think of that phrase because it's like, those are my people. They're the non-religious people that I'm charged with serving and that I love to serve and work with. And, you know, and they worry me at times. And there are times when I feel that, you know, whether it's young engineers and software designers and founders or the more established types, I kind of wish that they would listen to social justice oriented religious preachers rather than the sort of secular gospel of the hockey stick graph of at all costs and the invisible hand of the market that I think they are really worshiping.
Yes. I loved your discussion of the invisible hand, and that mythological aspect of it.
I know we're getting close to time. I'm really curious about one particular last thing here.
Go for it.
What's the future of humanism? We have lots of stories from Ray Kurzweil about how we'll upload ourselves into the cloud and what have you, but we also have really near-term things that are quite obvious now. You can't tell where, I end and this begins. Some of the neural decoding and neural implants and this move to, I find cybernetic to be an accurate word, but almost kind of an out-of-date word in a strange way. What's the future of being human when we don't really even know what choices are ours versus the technologies?
That's really powerful. Yeah, there really is a tension as we try to determine where we're headed with all this. The thing that strikes me perhaps the most is that we're dealing with extraordinary change across society. So obviously, when you think of change, you think of climate change, and you should, right? The sense that climate change could make our current forms of human life somewhat unrecognizable in a generation or two if we're not careful. But then there's also these technological changes, right? Even if it's on a positive level, or at least a positive to some, saying we're going to end death is a pretty big change.
Yeah.
And, it's a level of change that can be, that should be pretty disconcerting to a lot of people. When you move to a new house, even if it's a nice new house, you're still going to feel stress, because change itself is stressful. And the idea that we're going to end death and somehow make life meaningful, according to Ray Kurzweil, that's his quote, "Make life meaningful." To which I asked him, Mr. Kurzweil, Ray, doesn't that mean that life hasn't been meaningful up until now? Aren't you flying in the face of all religion and secular philosophy over the past 2,000 years? And he said, well, okay, maybe life has been somewhat meaningful until now. But it's a huge change. And then there's also the change in values, right? You can change your gender now. You can change, what you believe dramatically. And people are doing so, and et cetera, right? So we're dealing with a time where it's very difficult for a lot of the young people that I'm working with to even envision like what their world is going to look like in 10 or 20 years. And, I'll say sadly, maybe happily for them, but in my mind, sadly, it's not as urgent of a concern for a lot of Harvard or MIT types as it might be. Because there is the sense that because they're the elect, they're going to be the ones who are fine. And so, I think one future, Helen, one possible future is a future of increasing polarization. It's not surprising to me at all that we're becoming more polarized, because people really are realizing that in this technological society, there are going to be ever widening divides between those who are empowered enormously by the new tech and those who are forced to suffer from it. And people are increasingly racing to try to get on the good side, and or increasingly resentful of being left on the bad side. And so that's one possible direction, is that just increases. And as William Butler Yeats described, the center cannot hold in that polarized society. The other possibility, I guess, is that a movement arises that is based in what you'd call solidarity, mutual care and concern, democratic ideals of civic participation. But those things, I don't know that technology, I don't think you need to eliminate technology in order to bring those kinds of things about. But I don't know that technology is any kind of savior. Like we could point to the Arab Spring and say, well, it helped for people to reach each other on Twitter. But there's counter arguments there too. I mean, the point is that I think we need more low tech solutions for learning how to care about one another, to connect with one another, to feel a sense of common humanity, to feel the ability to embrace our own vulnerability and others' vulnerability, and just live together as human beings. Like, to me, that's what tech agnostic is ultimately about. Yeah, I immersed myself in 6 years of debates about tech policy and tech innovation and whatever. But it's ultimately a humanistic book about, like, can we fight for this more common future rather than just accept the polarization as if it were our fate.
And it's so strange to me and so weird that that's kind of how Silicon Valley started, is my impression.
The saving,
Yeah.
there was, the origins of the Valley and that crowd was very hippie-ish.
Yeah, the
if
whole
you go all
Earth
the way back to
catalog
the
and
Earth
all that
kind of
catalog.
stuff.
It was hippie libertarianism, though. It was the sense of, it was the guy that say, an Elizabeth Warren critiques when she says, go out and make your money. But, you had to transport your goods on the roads. You didn't build that road, right?
Yeah.
These were guys who, not only were some of them the techno-libertarians of old, not only were some of them born on third base and thought they hit a triple, but they were also people who, transported their goods across the roads and got, did so much self-mythologizing that they almost felt like they had built the roads themselves.
Yeah.
And, and it was women of color who assembled the circuit boards in the original Silicon Valley to make the original computers. Without their physical labor, the dangerous physical labor that made some of them sick, and kept many of them impoverished, there's no computers. And without the coding that takes place now of data by low-wage workers in colonized areas of the world, there's very little, if any, AI.
Very true.
And so my question is, when are we going to learn to care about those people as we would care about ourselves?
This has been a great conversation. There's one last parallel of our journey that I wanted to share with you, which is...
Please do.
You mentioned Kurzweil and the comment of meaning, and earlier you mentioned Zuckerberg and his statement about Meta in 2017. And there was something, I think, in that same messaging, but around the same time frame from Zuck, talking about how he was going to change the algorithm for Facebook feed to make those interactions more meaningful. And that sparked quite a long journey for us. It started with a piece that we wrote about Kierkegaard, and reflecting on whether it is even possible for something that is presented to you like a social media feed to be meaningful? Is that interaction possible to be meaningful if it is not an authentic choice? Classic sort of, in my mind at least, philosophical question that in some ways can be impossible to answer, but is worthy of, getting through it. Part of that reason I bring it up now is that there was something in my mind that I haven't been able to land, perhaps because I'm not enough of an expert in the history of philosophy, to sort of think about the existentialists, and at least some of what they were doing was in reaction to large-scale government imposition, large-scale religion, and trying to sort of find a different way of thinking about what it means to be human. And there was something there that I found that was sort of this glimmer of a parallel to this world of tech. And what does it mean to think like an existentialist? What does it mean to think like a humanist? I know they're not the same, but I was kind of lumping them together, and I know this is kind of a messy soup of my thought process here, and I apologize for that. But there's something really interesting in the fact that you and we both had a similar moment in reaction to that idea, that suddenly, tech was going to be able to make things more meaningful. And that just didn't sit well, and it's been a journey of ours trying to unpick and understand what it means, so much so that I'm reading the latest Elizabeth Bakewell book, I guess, on the history of humanism, to sort of digest these ideas even more.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautifully said, and I'd love to follow your journey. Great to be acquainted with you. To me, Sartre said existentialism is a humanism, and when I sign books for people, tech agnostic, what I like to do is I draw a little stick figure Sisyphus pushing up the rock.
Nice.
Because, there's not going to be one particular way in which we solve any or all of this. It's, the rock of greed and techno-solutionism is going to kind of keep rolling back down on us as we look for what meaningful communication with one another would be, right? Like, there's no one prescribed answer to that, in my opinion. So yeah, it's like each day we keep pushing the rock up the hill to try to get to a place where we've experienced real human connection. And I feel like given some time, like that's what you and I and people who like listening to you would feel more of. Yeah. So thank you for doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you for joining us. This has been really great. Highly recommend your book. I think it's there's a lot more in it that we haven't gotten to. But I think it's a very important piece to have in the public today. So thank you for writing that, and thank you for joining us.